Antisocieties by Michael Cisco. Cold November day. Bright sun cold on the water. The trees' bare boughs are embedded in a limpid blue sky. A spacious public park overlooking a wide river. Tall towers on the far side. Housing projects and apartment buildings on this side stretching off all around the park. A gleaming black car stops by the entrance to the park, and the administrator sets out onto the pavement. He is tall and bulky in his overcoat, muffler, and flat cap, all black wool, so that only his square face and square hands are exposed. He's closely shaved, his hands are well kept, and his back is straight. He enters the park, which slopes down to the water before him on all sides. A single person sits alone, centered on nearly every bench, all facing the water. The administrator follows the blacktop path to his right, which travels in a generous curve out toward some motionless trees still partially covered in brown or rust-colored leaves. As he draws near to the first occupied bench, the man sitting there shivers and straightens up. He does not look toward the administrator, but keeps his eyes hooded against the bright daylight, fixed on the twinkling water of the river below. The administrator pauses to examine the man for a moment, then sits lightly on the bench with him, eyeing him steadily, while the man continues to look at the water. The man speaks first. How... His voice is hoarse, and he continues to stare at the water. He is struggling to form a sentence. This goes on for a few seconds. "You may begin," the administrator says, simply. The man winces at the word "you." "How will the interview be conducted?" the man asks. The administrator lifts one hand, tilting it to and fro so that the signet ring on his middle finger flashes in the sun. "My ring records you." Again, the man winces at the word "you." "What is said?" he asks. "Yes." "Is recorded?" "Yes, it is." "Now?" "From the very beginning, yes." "Then that has been made clear." "Good." "Good." The man thinks, his lips working a bit. "Also," he says, with effort. "Also?" "Good. Also," the man says hastily. "You also find that good?" "It's agreed," the man says, wincing again. "Good." "Good." The man keeps his eyes on the water, the better to hide the terror that wells up in them. The administrator observes him neutrally. When the man speaks again, his voice is almost a bleat of fear. "And," the administrator waits, "and what did you..." He snaps his jaws shut on the word, and his eyes dart impulsively toward the administrator, who remains blandly impassive. "What was..." he starts again. "Were there any observations, visual observations, or sights made during... made in transit here? As he finishes the question, he releases a pent lungful of air. "My mouth framed in the rearview mirror," the administrator says. "That's good. That's good." "That's good, yes." The man nearly sighs through his nose and stops abruptly in a windless snort. He draws his lips into his mouth and presses them shut. His eyes fail to receive impressions. He struggles to keep himself completely still, sitting without breathing, without moving. The administrator watches him. He then raises his head and gazes to a high spot in the blue over the scintillating trees. A gleaming spindle turns its faceted side toward him, flaring as it catches the daylight. The administrator's eyes don't waver, blink, or squint. He raises his hands and ripples his fingers, typing in the air. The spindle rotates, turning edgewise to them, and melts back into the blue. I have other calls to make today, the administrator says briskly. You'll be all right here? Yes, the man yelps. Yes, I'm quite all right here. The administrator, paused in the act of standing up, watches the man for a full minute before straightening himself. Are you quite all right here? He asks quietly, as if he weren't repeating the man's words. I. The man trails off. His brow is contracted. His eyes are anguished. His mouth trembles. I'm fine, he says, after a moment. The administrator says, until later then. Yes, the man says, I'm fine. He pours all his hope and will into that word. His head wobbles as he bites back his voice. The administrator proceeds down the curving path toward a stand of trees. His erect posture and his unhurried pace make him seem taller than he is. The other citizens are sitting distributed in isolation there in front of him, positioned so that none can see any of the others, each one a private knot of tension against the oceanic prospect of countless empty windows across the river. Each an identical polished mirror, re-radiating the blue of the day, the river, the park, swept by metered waves of actinic light. The day will never end. There is more than enough time for him to make his assessment. Curved arcs of dazzling light, propagated outward from some source behind the man on the bench, loom overhead, roll massively past him, cross the river without catching on any of the little triangular waves that rise and fall with the current, and dash themselves against the glass towers opposite, shivering apart and collecting in seared lines. Watery green and purple squares float and scan inside the man's trembling eyelids. There is movement there that he can't see. He must watch for the least sign of activity in any of those million windows. Once he saw a scrap of something falling. It drifted between himself and the windows, a rag or scrap of paper, charred black, stiff. He wanted to say it was something like a bird, at least like a dead bird, but he didn't dare mention anything like a bird. There were no birds here. He never heard or saw any. This could mean many things, but alongside the possibility that birds were, for some inconceivable reason, banned from the park, from the city, nothing else mattered, and there was no reason to mention a bird. Perhaps he wasn't supposed to know what birds were, or perhaps he was supposed to have forgotten, but it seems very likely that whether either of these were truly the case, it made no sense to mention birds, or anything else for that matter, needlessly. Whether you did or didn't know what a bird was, most likely did not matter as much as acting as if birds were nothing to you, one way or another. The administrator wants a report, not conversation. That is the key. Conversations are for equals. Administrators and administratees do not have conversations. The former instruct and correct the latter report to the former return to the sending institution. The man knows that the administrator will come back. Until later, that's what he said. Later, in this ceaseless noontime, is any time, any number of times. And you don't look up at the spindles. There's no question of prohibition. That would be somehow too much. Nothing is prohibited. But corrections happen, and you are always liable to corrections. It is through these corrections that standards are imparted. No one assumes you should have known better. Each correction is an opportunity to learn, which is good. The standards are what is learned. Everyone is always learning the standards. There is no end to the learning, which is good, because it means the standards never stop developing. They are incessantly extended as they are brought to bear on every new circumstance. Even that charred scrap of fabric or paper that drifted and fell high up in the air. Between him and the banks of the city windows was a new experience which had to be reported, and had to receive in turn its place in the infinite compendium of circumstances governed by the standards. Even when, some uncertain amount of time ago, he had felt something, not quite a sensation, but what might have been liable to emerge as a sensation in his left foot, which had been removed in a previous correction, he had been required to report it to the administrator, who had smiled benignly and said, "This has been discovered and described in the articulation agreement. It will be recorded in a pre-existing category." It wasn't clear whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, and he didn't dare to ask, since it seemed that the administrator tended to take it for granted that he would know what was or was not a good thing, and uncertainty about the goodness of a thing would amount to an admission of ignorance, which would guarantee correction. Correction was always guaranteed in general, and welcome by definition. He was almost certainly making a mistake by not rising on his one remaining foot to ask for correction, which might come as a relief, as hard as that might be. Corrections were hard. That was consistent with standards. Trying to avoid that hardness was a sign that you were naively attached to your ignorance, and perhaps also, as it were, getting ahead of yourself. Since calculations based on any prospective extension of standards would require a more thorough understanding of them than anyone could be expected to possess, perhaps even within the sending institution. This understanding primarily takes the form of a recognition of the intrinsic boundlessness of the standards, which entails the interminable accumulation of recommendations. These recommendations arise as a consequence of corrections. Each correction clarifies a point in the standards. The overall shape, the intended goal, is a chimera in thought now, and will only become clear as standards develop, correction by correction, recommendation by recommendation. This is the method of the standard. He is drawn back into the present by a dull pressure that grows against the middle of his back. There is a nerve-wracking shudder and a sickness as he is fed, and it takes some time for this alarming sensation to fade again. He remembers the day his left foot was amputated. It had been raining. The administrator was different then. This was not a particularly long ago, maybe not the last time that there had been a period of repeated showers, but almost certainly not further back than the time before that. The interval between periods of repeated showers was long, but not as long as the interval separating periods of sustained high or low temperatures. The administrator had interviewed him for a long time that day, so long that he felt his eyelids droop and his head began to dip, and he couldn't be sure what he was saying, or even if he was still speaking. The administrator's simple questions, which were all so similar that they seemed to require of him the same answer in a series of very trifling variations became muffled and unmanageable. They were like clouds shot through with beams of fierce light, alternately numbing and jarring him. It must have been obvious that he was exhausted. He wondered how he must have appeared to the administrator, and if he might have nodded off while continuing to speak, even while continuing to answer the administrator's questions. They weren't questions, really, so much as they were statements with which he was supposed to agree. And his answers weren't really answers either, so much as they were only paraphrases of the statements put to him. The day had been rainy. He was soaking into his clothes and turning to mush. Water sluiced down his neck from his saturated hair. Rain pooled in the palm of his limp left hand, lying beside him on the bench, between him and the former administrator, as if he were offering the rain to the administrator. His legs were crossed, and his left foot hung in space. He had just started back again from the brink of sleep, tossing his head weakly upward and trying to see the falling petals of rain in among the rain-blackened tree trunks, bright yellow leaves plastered flat to black mud, the veiled river coiling and heaving in high tide, and behind it there were the impassive empty windows streaked with the black shadows of rain, behind which there was supposed to be some kind of movement that he must watch for, and would never see. The administrator said something he couldn't quite make out, not much more than a low murmuring that might have been addressed, he now thinks, to someone else, listening remotely, and simultaneously leaned down. Bending at the waist, the administrator leaned down toward the ground and pulled something transparent and luminous out between his hands, like a sheet of transparent paper. And this was then slid edgewise through his left ankle, stopping halfway through as the sheet became rigid. The administrator's face was only inches from his own, and watched him, neutrally. The sheet continued to slide through his ankle, with a faint crinkling sound, until he felt the weight of his left foot drop from the end of his left leg, and he heard the hollow sound his foot made inside his shoe when it struck the ground. The transparent sheet, flexible again, wrapped itself around the stump at once. Not a drop of blood spilled from his leg. He smelled burning flesh. That's what the administrator had said when he leaned down. "You're going to smell barbecue," he had said softly. The man felt the long bones of his left calf splinter. A hormonal wave bellied up into his brain and made him gasp and stare as a long, thin wail lifted, ripped into the sound of falling rain. It was his voice he heard. The administrator's face was still inches from his own, gazing, blank. The sheet gripped the stump of his left foot fiercely. The fabric clenched and shoved as if it were a living thing trying to push itself under him. The administrator transferred his attention to the end of the man's left leg, which was still crossed over his right, probing it with his thick middle finger. Now, the man wonders if crossing his legs had been the error this amputation had corrected. It might be that sitting with legs crossed was insufficiently respectful, if in appearance only, but now that his left foot had been amputated, he couldn't rest the stump of his left leg on the ground directly, and was compelled to keep his legs crossed. The correction might have been intended to encourage that behavior by making it impossible to do otherwise, or it might have been a way of codifying his disrespect by forcing him to adopt that posture as a permanent attitude. The main idea was, it seems most probable, to strip from him the power to choose whether or not to cross his legs. After the administrator had left with his habitual decorum and gentle speech, the man stared at his severed foot, still in its battered shoe, lying on its side just a few inches away from the burning, trembling stump of his ankle, with the sheet of amputation fabric clenching and almost gnawing at what was now the end of his leg. Rain dripped from the shockingly white, sheared bones. Nausea swept through him. He started to shake, and all his blood seemed to pool in his center. He couldn't remember when his foot wasn't there, lying on his side in front of him anymore, but it didn't happen right away. Not anything at all like right away, and he didn't see what was done with his severed left foot. The fabric dropped away some time after that, plopping to the ground like a sated parasite, and the administrator had collected it and folded it and placed it in a large interoffice envelope. It was from this envelope that he had at first extracted a grayish sock, which he handed to the man. He told the man distinctly to put it over the stump, and the man had done so immediately with a flash of gratitude. The sock was itchy and tight, and the man didn't want it on him. He was grateful to have received a direct, unambiguous order. It was like a gift, something he could do, and do at once, that would, in some small measure, satisfy the administrator. This was so much better than their conversations and his reports that he would have done any number of meaningless, enervating tasks under explicit instructions instead, if that were permitted. Evidently, the sending institution did not prohibit administrators from issuing commands, but perhaps standards discouraged them from doing it, or, as was more likely, restricted the use of unambiguous language to particular circumstances, like medical emergencies. Before the amputation sheet, which was by this time a flabby, sallow, almost rubbery membrane, was inserted into the envelope, he had been required to write a brief account of certain aspects of his recovery directly onto it, using a gleaming steel pen the administrator had provided. The tip of the pen wrote by applying heat to the membrane, which caused it to pucker into letters, and as the man continued to write his account, which was dictated to him by the administrator, the membrane, which at first had seemed so loose that it was on the point of liquefying, parched and curdled into something like hard vellum. The administrator had sealed it into the interoffice envelope and written something in one of the empty fields on the outside, using his personal dull gray stylus. The man was also required to sign for his foot. The administrator had withdrawn from somewhere in his enormous greatcoat a thick, leather-bound notepad that bristled with insertions and dangling paper tapes. "Press hard," he'd been told. The administrator extracted a sickly green carbon of the receipt from the pages, inserted it into a clear plastic badge, and handed it to the man. "Clip it to your lapel, just below your second tractate tag, but above the second button. It must be visible at all times from now on until you're instructed otherwise." The badge was still there, but exposure had clouded it so much that the receipt, now faded to colorlessness, was illegible inside it. The man raises his eyes slowly. The administrator is standing by the bench again. He's different now than he was back then. "Still quite all right?" he asks, pleasantly, without moving, his hands in the pockets of his greatcoat. "Fine," the man says, everything inside him sinking away into icy blankness. He's come back. It's never good when the administrator comes back. The administrator sits on the bench, and for an unreal moment, it's as if he'd never left. Not even the daylight has changed, not even his shadow, documenting him on the ground beside the bench. "It's a very fine day," the administrator says. "Very fine," the man says. The administrator swivels his head slowly around, scanning the park, the river, and the blistering towers on the far side, as mechanically as an automated camera. The man stares in helpless fascination at the administrator's fingers as they steeple, open and shut, angling up and down against his dark clothes. pale and like a luminous readout scanning him for fluctuations of modifications and modulations of. The administrator is not facing the man when he speaks again. I was thinking over our conversation of earlier today, the administrator says. I like to reflect carefully on everything I have heard, everything I have been told. It gives me something special to savor as I walk. It helps me to relax, to collect myself. Some days it is so difficult to collect yourself, don't you think? I'm not sure what you mean, the man says. This is a ploy. You must not commit to anything unless you are compelled to, and you must avoid affirming or denying anything vague. There have been times when, in conversation, he's seen a menacing gleam and hardness, a captor's relish, come into the administrator's eyes as he spoke in a certain rapid, complicated way that he knew the man could not understand. Well, for example, I wonder what it means to claim as you do to be fine when you are asked whether or not you are quite all right. It is useless to try to remember the conversation. He has a recording. You don't, but even if you had a photographic memory, how could you contradict an administrator? They take exhaustive records only to study your profile, not so as to be bound to their contents themselves. I was unaware of any difference. So, for you to say you are fine and to say you are quite all right are the same thing? Now that you say them together, I'm not sure. You're not. I am not sure that there is no difference between saying I am quite all right and saying I am fine. The difference did not occur to me at the time. That there would be a difference, or could be a difference, did not occur to me at the time. What do you suppose the difference might be between being fine and being quite all right? I'm not sure I see a difference. You're not sure you see? Can you say that again, please? A flash of alarm. Can you say it exactly as you did before? Did you say that you saw a difference, or only you saw a difference? You didn't see a difference. I'm not sure I see a difference. The administrator is quiet for a while. He is no longer swiveling his head, but sits looking straight ahead, his palms on his thighs, hidden beneath his greatcoat. Perhaps there is none, he said at last. The question is unimportant, provided that you meant the same thing by fine as I did by quite all right. The administrator remains quiet for a long time. Waves of golden light flash over the silent park. How might we go about determining that? He asks musingly. There is nothing musing or even particularly describable about his manner. Do you remember what you meant when I asked you if you were quite all right, and you answered that you were fine? I meant... The man is breathing through his mouth, fighting an impulse to gasp for breath, his eyes riveted on the empty air where his left foot used to be. I meant that I had nothing out of the ordinary to report. Nothing out of the ordinary. I wonder if that's possible. There was a note of derision in the administrator's voice. The man crumples. As if the administrator actually gestures with his hand, waving it a little toward the park, the river, the glass panes. Well, merely a matter of course. The man says recklessly, no longer trusting his reasoning, to refer only to my own condition. Your own condition being at the time nothing out of the ordinary, and that's what you meant by fine? That's what you say when you're asked if you're quite all right, that your condition at the time is nothing out of the ordinary? I saw it at the time no difference between affirming that I was quite all right and affirming that I was fine. And so you likewise failed to see at the time what it would mean to claim that you, or, excuse me, your condition, he added with disdain, were in perfect accord with the ordinary. My my oversight is clear to me now. I see now that I did not think sufficiently clearly about the assertion that nothing was out of the ordinary with me. What I meant was that, so far as I knew, that there was nothing unusual happening. Happening. I was not at the time aware of anything unusual, of there being anything unusual about me at the time. And what do you suppose might be unusual about you? I am not aware of what might be unusual about me. Then how can you see what is unusual and what is not unusual, and make wild claims about being in no way out of the ordinary? I can't see what is unusual and what is not unusual. What I am familiar with, not that I know it, but what I am familiar with is what is usual. Then your vision is at fault, the administrator says with finality, his mouth snapping shut. The administrator raised his hand abruptly, the ring flashing in the daylight, and the man couldn't help himself. He twisted his head around on his stiff and aching neck to look at the administrator. The administrator reached out and touched the man's something on the side of the man's head. The man was staring at the administrator's face when his vision went out, all at once, without the slightest sensation, forever.